get Daniel Black on the line from MSU Bulldog Blitz, breaking down the Dogs. So it's the natural transition period, but especially in a Mike Leach offense that we'll talk quarterbacks, then go right to the wide receivers. The top two pass catchers are back, but one's a running back. Jaden Wally's a really good one at 52 catches last season. What's the rest of the core look like?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Jaden Wally. He's definitely going to be the leader of this wide receiver core. All eyes are going to be on him from last year. Started out slow, wasn't really a very big factor in the Mississippi State wide receiving core at the beginning of the year last year, but came on strong, multiple 100-yard games. He's definitely going to be the leader of this receiving core. Some other names: Austin Williams is one. He is the most experienced receiver in this group. It seems like he's been on Mississippi State's team for the past 6 or 7 years at this point. It seems like one of those 7-year seniors that you see occasionally. Obviously, he's not that, but he's definitely the most experienced in the group. Had 43 receptions last year for 372 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's definitely one of the more dependable receivers on Mississippi State's receiving core, and will probably get a lot more catches next year. Lee Keith is another name that Mississippi State fans and people who will be watching Mississippi State this year will be looking at. Another name that didn't have a whole lot of production last year, but has the potential and the talent to make a massive step up list this year is Tulu Griffin. Last year, he only had 6 receptions for 61 yards, but he made a name for himself in the return game last year, especially in the bowl game against Tulsa. Had a kick return for a touchdown in that game, but he's someone who Mississippi State's coaching staff is really looking to take a step up. And 2 receivers, one redshirted last season and another just didn't play last year. 2 receivers that have really been making names for themselves in training camp that will more than likely be pretty significant contributors to this offense is Makai Polk and Rufus Harvey. Rufus Harvey is from Starkville. He was someone who Mississippi State, when Mike Leach was first hired, didn't have an offer from Mississippi State until Mike Leach got hired. And then shortly thereafter, shortly before signing day, Rufus Harvey got an offer. And it's something that a lot of Mississippi State people were sort of clamoring for because he was very, very talented out of Starkville High. He was someone who dealt with COVID issues last year. He had it himself and then dealt with contact tracing and then actually got injured later on in the year. So he never got the opportunity to play. But he's someone who a lot of people are pointing to as a potential significant contributor in 2021. He's been making a name for himself in camp, as well as Makai Polk, who I mentioned earlier. So those are just some names in the receiving core that I think Mississippi State will be depending on this coming season.
Got Daniel Black on the line from MSU Bulldog Blitz, breaking down the Dogs as they prepare for the SEC and get underway on September 4th, along with just about everybody else. Louisiana Tech is week 1 in Starkville. All right. Not too out of the ordinary here. Leading rusher for a Mike Leach offense at 312 yards rushing, but also that same said running back catching 60 passes out of the backfield, even in a short season. So that's pretty indicative of Mike Leach on both ends of that. Got to run the ball once in a while. But at the same time, using those running backs out of the backfield as pass catchers.
That's right. Mississippi State's got a duo of running backs who they will be depending on. They got some playing time last year, a lot more playing time towards the end of the year. Obviously, a year ago, all eyes were on Kylan Hill as the starting running back. But by the end of the season, he was no longer with the team. So Mississippi State pointed to 2 running backs led by Jaquavius Marks. He has been the first game against LSU. He only got 3 carries for 15 yards. But if you look at his stat line, he became a lot more involved in the offense. Got 10 rushes against Arkansas, 9 against Alabama, 12 against Missouri, 11 against Tulsa. And once again, those aren't really usually a lot of carries in most offenses. But in this one, getting double-digit carries for a single running back in a Mike Leach offense is kind of substantial. He ended up having 70 yards against Missouri and a touchdown, 72 yards and a touchdown against Tulsa. But obviously, you got to talk about the pass game when talking about Mike Leach running backs. He got 10 receptions against Arkansas, 9 against A&M. Ended up having 4 receptions for 30 yards against Tulsa. So Jaquavius Marks was someone who was going to be leading the Mississippi State running game. I guess a combination of running game and being a receiver in this offense at running back. And the other is Dylan Johnson. Dylan Johnson got 51 carries for 225 yards and 4 touchdowns a year ago. Like Jaquavius Marks was another threat in the backfield that Mississippi State turned to as Kylan Hill. His production started to wane towards the end of the year. He ended up being the most productive rusher in that game against Tulsa. Had 6 carries for 57 yards. Ended up having 36 receptions for 157. And obviously, that playing time, because of Kylan Hill at the beginning of the year, was a bit limited between the two of them. So coming into 2021, they're going to be the two guys at running back that Mississippi State's going to depend on, not only to run the ball, but also to catch passes. So Jaquavius Marks and Dylan Johnson are going to be the two workhorses at running back. I guess running back / receiver for State. And they're two guys who really showed some flashes of greatness a year ago, and State's looking to build on that with them this coming season.
Yeah, we're not accustomed to seeing a Mike Leach offense struggle as it did for much of the first half of the season, but caught its stride down the stretch. And one of the things that's going to give them a chance to explode, of course, is going to be the offensive line. And for the most part, it looks like it remains intact.
Yeah, most of the offensive linemen are coming back from Mississippi State. There's one offensive lineman who many Mississippi State people were hoping would have a good season last year, and that was Scott Lashley, who was a transfer from Alabama. But he ended up getting injured right before the season, a couple days before the first game of the year against LSU. Mississippi State, it was announced that he got injured, but he's going to be coming back. He decided to take a COVID year. And we'll be back starting for Mississippi State on the offensive line this season. Some other ones, LaQuinston Sharp is someone who's going to be a senior who's going to be starting along the offensive line. Charles Cross is a guy who was a 5-star recruit out of high school, going to be coming into his redshirt sophomore year. Someone who Mississippi State is really looking to take a massive step up. Cannon Boone is someone who's going to be a true freshman this year, who's been getting some hype out of camp, as well as Albert Reese, who's another another true freshman. He's from Alberta, Canada. He's 6'7", 315 pounds, an absolute monster. Those are a couple of freshmen who actually might end up having a contribution to this Mississippi State team. But between Nick Jones, Charles Cross, LaQuinston Sharp, and Scott Lashley, although Lashley didn't end up playing last year, he's been in this offense for a bit during practice last season and now throughout training camp. Those are some guys who will be stepping up and being significant contributors in the offensive line this year, most of the guys returning. And the offensive line was a unit that sort of came in ebbs and flows last year, sort of a Jekyll and Hyde situation. As long as the offensive line was solid, Mississippi State was able to move the ball. And the games in which Mississippi State was totally stagnant on offense, the offensive line was getting flattened right out of the gate. KJ Costello never really had much time to throw beyond the LSU game. He ends up getting injured. And then Will Rogers had the exact same situation in games like Vanderbilt and Auburn. But in those wins that Mississippi State had, or I mean, even against Georgia, when Mississippi State nearly knocked off Georgia in Athens, Mississippi State's offensive line was very solid. They were solid against Missouri. They were solid against Tulsa. And Mississippi State was able to move the ball. State didn't put up crazy numbers against Tulsa, but they were still able to score and had more production than many games in the regular season. So the offensive line is in my opinion, the most critical aspect of Mississippi State's team this year. If Mississippi State is going to make it to another bowl game, hit that 6-7 win mark, the offensive line is going to have, for the most part, have a solid year. But if State's going to have a bad year, it's because the offensive line struggled. The offensive line is of the utmost importance for this air raid offense to work.